Hi, everybody. I was asleep and somebody just rang my bell. I live in a bad neighborhood, and for whatever reason, they're always harassing me. They don't understand that the purpose of doors and walls is to keep people out. I do sleep with my light on, but that doesn't mean that I'm awake. So, because I can't go back to sleep, I decided that I'm going to go ahead and do a quick live stream explaining anarchy and the philosophy of liberty because there are a great deal of misconceptions, especially when it comes to anarchy. But I'm going to start by reviewing a video by Noam Chomsky, and then I'm going to review the video of the philosophy of liberty. All right, y'all. So I realize that most of y'all are not awake right now, but you can catch the replay.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, anything.
Okay. Um, we're led to think that anarchism is bomb-throwing mayhem. What is it that attracts you to anarchism?
Anarchism has nothing to do with bomb-throwing mayhem. Anarchism is a point of view which, first of all, it covers a lot of things. You know, political rhetoric is not the clearest. It's not a model of clarity, and anarchism has covered quite a lot of ground. But the mainstream of it has just been the basic principle, which I think comes straight out of classical liberalism and the Enlightenment.
Okay, so he was talking about classical liberalism, which I consider myself to be a classical liberal. Um, when people use the term liberal now, that means the complete opposite of what classical liberalism is. Classical liberalism was about limited government. Now liberals want the government to regulate everything, and they think that this is the way that you get freedom, and it's actually not. You want the government to have the least amount of freedom. I mean, the least amount of power and authority possible.
That any form of authority and domination has a burden of proof to bear. It has to demonstrate that it's legitimate. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's inside a family or the global economy.
Okay, y'all. So he just mentioned within the family because there is a thing called parental anarchy, um, which I'm not going to get into. I haven't watched this video in a while, so I don't know if he addresses it in this one. But parental anarchy is a thing. Like basically, all forms of authority have to be proven. Like there's a burden of proof on that person. I've made posts before or a survey, I believe it was, when I was asking what is the basis of a parent's authority over their children. I don't remember what the response was, but yeah, you have a burden of proof. There's not a presumption that somebody has the right to control you.
If it's if it is a form of authority and domination and coercion, it has to show that it's legitimate. If it can demonstrate it's legitimate, heavy burden to bear. If it shows that it's legitimate, okay. If not, it ought to be dismantled. That's anarchism.
So that's anarchy in a nutshell. It's not that all forms of authority are invalid. It's illegitimate authority that is invalid, and basically, it's illegitimate if it's not based on consent. So, and we're going to get into all that because because things are so upside down, topsy turvy, the way things are right now. People don't know up from down. They don't know why things are the way they are. They think that it's supposed to be this way, that the government is supposed to dictate everything that you do in your life, and that's not liberty. And you can't um, impose liberty through force. Um, and there's also a big misconception about what rights are. Rights are to limit the government's power. You don't have a right to other people's property, and you don't have a right to provision. You don't have a right to anything that doesn't exist in nature. You only have a right to which you produce, which we're going to get into all of that.
Okay, now, what is considered legitimate authority?
It's the task of those who have the authority to demonstrate that. So, for example, if I'm taking a walk with my granddaughter, and oops, okay, and suppose I'm taking a walk with my granddaughter, and she runs out into the street, okay, and I grab her and pull her back. Well, that's authority, and it's my task to demonstrate that it's legitimate. And I think in this case, if anybody challenged me, I could make an argument saying that's legitimate authority. But the burden of proof is always on those who exercise it. That's true if it's men and women, parents and children, owners and people they rent, the state and people who serve it, the IMF and people who follow its orders, wherever it is. So there's no general definition of what legitimate authority is. It's the task of those who exercise authority to demonstrate their legitimacy. They're the ones who have the burden of proof. And if they can't meet that burden by explaining why what they do is legitimate, then they have no right to exercise the authority. And whatever institution, any institution within which they exercise it, is illegitimate unless they show otherwise.
This is the problem, right? Because there's this presumption that all government authority is legitimate. It's like, no. Even if you were to use the social contract theory, it would be based on powers delegated to the state that are enumerated in the Constitution. But the government routinely exercises authority which is not enumerated, and people just go along with it. They don't challenge it. They don't know their basic rights. They don't know the difference between a basic piece of legislation and a constitutional provision. It's like the Constitution trumps a law. Just because somebody passes a law saying you must get vaccinated, where does it say that in the Constitution? If you don't have the authority to do that, it's illegitimate.
And the anarchists are just people who believe that and try to do something about it.
So the members of that institution, is it their responsibility to make a judgment call about the authority of the person who is trying to prove their legitimate authority?
Well, I don't mean that every minute of the day everybody has to be saying, look, this is my legitimate authority, but they have to be prepared to meet the challenge.
Sure.
So if it's like suppose it's a formally democratic state, well, in principle, that challenge is met by interchange among the population, which recognizes the authority of actions in the public arena through constant interaction, debate, struggle, and so on. In theory, that's what happens if it is a democratic state. To the extent that that doesn't happen, it's not a democratic state and it is illegitimate. When you move to other systems of authority, like, say, private corporations or fascist states or other forms of totalitarianism, there's no question of legitimacy because they have none.
Right. So, but
Okay, but the corporation or private corporations are creations of the state. This is why it's ignorant for people to say that they recognize the authority of the government, but not the authority of corporations, or that corporations are evil, but the government is good. Like, no, you have to go to the government to file to create a fictitious entity. And the government basically creates a person. This is that we get into this whole discussion about corporate personhood, which has a limited number of constitutional rights, which can actually infringe on the rights of flesh and blood human beings. But you can't be against corporatism without questioning the government itself or statism. They go hand in hand. Well, you don't necessarily need corporatism to have statism, but the way that our system is set up, corporatism is almost it's almost hard to differentiate the corporations from the government. That's how powerful corporations are. So it's almost like who's leading whom. Like, the corporations sort of dictate what public policies we're going to have. So but again, it was the government which allowed them to exist in the first place, because before I believe it's like the late 1800s to late 19th century. They created private corporations. Before that, all corporations were public. They couldn't exist in perpetuity. They had to be renewed every so often, like 7 years or so, and they had to exist for a public purpose. They couldn't exist for a private purpose. But now we have private corporations, which I think was a huge mistake.
It's the responsibility of the other people in that institution, whatever that institution might be, to question and to
No, it's
challenge.
not their responsibility. It's their responsibility to meet the challenge. It's the responsibility of people to make the challenge. So it's the responsibility of, say, women to challenge a framework in which they are supposed to wash the dishes and put the children to sleep and that sort of thing. And it's the responsibility of men in a traditional patriarchic family to answer that challenge. I mean, it would be nice if the challenge could be raised by those in positions of authority, but that's pretty rare. I mean, usually when you're in a position of authority, you kind of internalize the values that say it's right and just.
Well, the way to challenge the authority of government would be to sue them and follow lawsuit. However, they're protected with qualified immunity for basic state actors, and then judicial state actors are protected with absolute immunity. So they don't even have to justify it. It's just, I'm the government. I say it. I'm protected with immunity. I can do whatever I want. You're just a slave. The law doesn't apply to me because I work for the government. Doesn't matter if I um, assaulted you. There are even cases where they literally kill people and they get off because they claimed qualified immunity. And qualified immunity just means that you acted in good faith. Or there's what are the two elements of qualified immunity? That you had a good faith intention to comply with the law. I forget the other element. I haven't looked at that in a long time, but it's a very low threshold where you can just make up any kind of bullshit, and then a court is going to give deference to the government, even though they completely violated your rights, murdered your child, and they get off on it. And by the way, if they file a motion for summary judgment, it doesn't even go before a jury. Like, um, basically, if the facts are not in dispute, um, which I think the facts are always in dispute, but they'll say because I don't know, it, the courts the judge has so much distraction, discretion. It's like you're entitled to a jury trial, but if the judge says that the facts are not in dispute, then they can basically take away your right to a jury trial. And then, not, I mean, in civil cases, I'm not talking about criminal. Um, and then they can grant summary judgment for the stay and dismiss your lawsuit.
And the reason is because most people are sort of decent human beings, and it's very hard to look in the mirror and say, I'm a bastard. So usually what you do is look in the mirror and say, I'm a nice guy, and I do these things because it's right and just and legitimate. And that's pretty standard, I mean, everybody knows that from their own experience. We don't have to go into it. That's what people are like. And therefore the responsibility of raising the challenge is typically in the hands of those who recognize that they have a subordinate status. It's very hard to recognize that. I mean, people live, for millennia, without recognizing that they are being subordinated in systems of power. I mean,
I don't understand how people don't recognize it. You are an abject subjugation. Like, there's so many things that you can't do, and yet people. I mean, it's not that you can't do it, but you need permission. You need a license to work. Your the length of your grass can only be a certain height. Um, how you raise your children, how they're educated, um, what foods are approved to be sold in stores, what drugs you can take. This pretty much everything that you do on a daily basis is controlled. I don't know how people don't. I don't understand how people miss that. Like they think that they're free. It's like no. I mean, if you get sick, you can't even choose your own medication. You can only choose. You can only choose what the FDA approved. You could be dying from cancer, and then you don't have access to something that could actually save your life. So, no, you're not free by a long shot.
True of women, for example. Or slaves. I mean, most slave societies were accepted by the slaves as legitimate and in fact necessary. A large part, and the same is true of, for example, people who have jobs today in our society. Uh, Almost without exception, they consider it legitimate for them to be in a position where they have to rent themselves in order to survive. That's certainly not obvious, and in fact,
He did a separate discussion about wage slavery, which I'm not going to get into right now. But yeah, when you work for a business entity, you're essentially a wage slave. He basically compared it to Jim Crow. It's instead of corporations owning you, they're renting you. Which I'm not going to get into that. I may do a separate video on that later.
if you go back a century ago, uh, it was not only considered not obvious, it was considered outlandish by American working people. I'm not talking about Marxists or socialists or anybody like that, but say mill hands in Lowell, Massachusetts, who never heard of socialism, who regarded it as a form of slavery and were complaining that they had not fought the Civil War to replace chattel slavery by wage slavery, and that therefore those who work in the mills ought to own them, because that's the Republican rights that we won in the American Revolution, and so on and so forth. So, it's not obvious. But by now, I think enough indoctrination and propaganda and so on has taken place, so people do regard that form of subordination to external authority as legitimate. Whether they should is another question, but the fact is they do, just as for most of history women have accepted a subordinate role as correct and proper and so on, and slaves did, and people living in, say, feudal societies. In a feudal society, people had a place, some kind of role. And quite typically, the societies were stable because people regarded those structures as legitimate. The same is true of religious structures, and I mean, throughout human life, there's a whole variety of systems of authority and oppression and domination and so on, which are usually accepted as legitimate by the people subordinated to them. When they don't, you have struggles and revolutions and sometimes changes and sometimes brutality and so on.
By the way, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that you cannot have a revolution without violence or like basically meaningful change. He calls it tumult. Um, so, according to him, peaceful or whatever peaceful resistance is not really effective. Like it because basically they're only going to give you what you want if it serves their interests or if you're not actually a threat to the system. So whatever you're going to get from the government from protesting or um, awareness is basically going to be incrementalism. You're not going to have any radical change from the government without violence.
That's, as far as I understand it, anarchists are just people who take this seriously.
Right. We do take it seriously. We don't want to be slaves. We don't accept the illegitimate authority of those who want to control us. But now we're going to get into the philosophy of liberty, and then this really breaks it down. I probably should have done this as a separate live stream because I don't know how many. A lot of times people only listen to the first bit of it, but I think this part right here is the most important. So that's the philosophy of liberty. There's an audio version of it, but this one is just visual, so I guess I'm just going to go ahead and read it. The philosophy of liberty is based on the principle of self ownership. You own your life. To deny this is to imply another person has a higher claim on your life than you do. No other person or group of persons owns your life, nor do you own the lives of others. I want y'all to let that sink in because the entire philosophy of liberty is based on the principle of self ownership. You own yourself, other people don't own you. And so you basically have agency of your entire life, according to this philosophy, you would think that this philosophy would be self evident, but most people don't agree with it. They do believe that the group, the mob, has a right to control you. You exist in time, past, present, and future. Right. I've mentioned this before in several of my videos, but now we're going to actually explain what that means. This is manifest in life, liberty, and the product of your life and liberty. So the product of your life and liberty is property, and we're going to explain what that means too. To lose your life is to lose your future. To lose your liberty is to use your present. To lose the product of your life and liberty is to lose all that portion of your past that produced it. So when your property is taken away from you, you're basically giving away one of yourselves. You're giving away your past, or it's taken away from you. A product of your life and your liberty is your property. Property is the fruit of your labor, the product of your time, energy, and talent. Property is that part of nature which you turn to valuable use. So that's when you actually produce a product. That's what I mean. Again, y'all have heard me say this in many of my videos. I talk about the producers and the takers, right? Anyway, that's what I'm referring to. Like when you actually produce a product, then you have a valuable contribution to society. There are people who don't produce anything. There are parasites, the lawyers, the judges, I don't know, they're basically engaging in usury. They don't produce anything. All they do is siphon wealth from others who do produce. Property is the property of others that is given to you by voluntary exchange and mutual consent. So when they talk about that, they're basically talking about free market competition. Right, voluntary exchange, right, without restrictions placed on you by the government. Two people who exchange property voluntarily are better off, or they wouldn't do it. Again, this is what free market capitalism is, laissez-faire. If it wasn't mutually beneficial, they wouldn't do it. Therefore, the government has no right to interfere and tell you what is in your best interest, to try to impose regulations that the two parties to that contract or agreement did not anticipate. Only they may rightfully make that decision for themselves. Exactly. At times, some people use force or fraud to make others. I'm sorry. At times, people use force or fraud to take from others without voluntary consent. Basically, taxation and other forms of usury, including traffic citations and all kinds of scams from the government to take your hard earned money. And money is basically your past, so they're basically taking one of your cells and killing you. Initiation of force or fraud to take life is murder. This is why, okay, when I say that, this is where this comes from. It comes from the philosophy of liberty. When you take someone's life, no, I'm sorry, I got that part wrong. Okay, just let me just play that part. Okay, so to take life is murder, which is basically to take your future away is murder. To take your liberty, which is basically your present, is slavery, and to take your past away is theft, because your property is the time and energy that you spend in your past to produce it. This is the same whether these actions are done by one person acting alone, by the many acting against a few, or even officials with fine hats. Just because it's done by government officials doesn't make it less oppressive. They're still committing those same acts. They're still committing murder. They're still committing theft. And what was the other one? I forget. I just forgot that quickly. You have the right to protect your own life, liberty, and property, justly acquired from the forceful aggression of others. So, and the Constitution basically gives you a right to form private militias, which is basically your protection from government tyranny. And now they've made the Second Amendment into something else about individuals having a right to own guns. Um, Nobody even talks about private militias anymore. Before the police state, we didn't have a standing military, we didn't have a standing police force. Whenever there was a need for political or I don't know forceful action, they would basically form Minutemen or whatever to protect their own communities. And now we have a standing police force and military which goes around uh, enslaving humanity. And you may ask others to help defend you, but you do not have the right to initiate force against the life, liberty, and property of others. You do not have the right to take the life, liberty, or property of others. You do not have that right. You do not have the right to designate some person to initiate force against others on your behalf. This is referred to as the non-aggression principle. Principle. So when you try to seek, uh, what is it called? Ju- uh, Government action to basically take someone else's property or to control someone else's life, to say, oh, I think that person should be vaccinated. I think that person should XYZ. You are violating the non aggression principle. Like I said before, all acts of government are acts of violence. So by supporting government regulations or government oversight over our daily lives, you are a violent bitch. You have the right to seek leaders for yourselves, but you have no right to impose rulers onto others. Just because you decided to participate in this dog and pony show doesn't mean that I have to go along with it. I do not, and I don't accept your leaders. Those are your leaders, they're not mine. No matter how officials are selected, they are only human beings and they have no rights or claim they're higher than those of other human beings. I don't know why people think that just because they're government officials, they're gods, like they still put their pants on one leg at a time. They're not superior to anyone. Like it's just this slavish mentality that, oh, it's the government and it's the judge. Like, fuck, grow up here. Like, he's a human being. What I mean, there's a whole psychology behind that. There's a reason why the judge elevates his bench to make you have to look up to him and the colors of their robes and all that shit. It's all mind control. Regardless of the imaginative labels for their behavior or the numbers of people encouraging them. What is that logical fallacy, argumentum ad populum? Just because a large number of people agree to something, that doesn't make it right. Just because a large number of people want to be slaves and submit themselves to the authority of an illegitimate government doesn't make it right. Officials have no right to murder, to enslave, or to steal. You cannot give rights to you cannot give them any rights that you do not have yourself. Again, the government is based on delegated authority. It's based on the consent of the government. It's a social contract. So if you don't have those rights, then you can't give it to the government. The government doesn't have the right to control my life because based on the principle of self-ownership, it is my life, not yours. And just because the majority decided it doesn't make it valid. Since you own your own life, you are responsible for your life. You do not rent your life from others to demand your obedience. Nor are you a slave to others to demand your sacrifice. You choose your own goals based on your own values. It's based on your values. It's not based on society's values. Like, you're not a sacrificial animal to like you get to make decisions for yourselves. The public doesn't get to veto what you decide to do with your life, whether it's being homosexual, whether it's getting an abortion, whatever it is, as long as you're not harming them, you own your life and you should be able to do whatever the fuck you want. Success and failure are both the necessary incentives to learn and grow. Your action on behalf of others or their action on behalf of you is virtuous only when it's derived from voluntary mutual consent. So if you're helping people based on force, then there's nothing virtuous about that, right? They just basically took your money at gunpoint and gave it to somebody else, and then you get to feel good about yourself. No, I'm virtuous if I help people of my own volition, and I should have the liberty to choose which charities I support to further my own virtue. So you may think that St. Jude's or some other bullshit charity. I'm sorry, not to say that those are bullshit charities, but I may think that some other charity is more impactful. Like, for example, I would probably choose a charity that I don't know, furthers reproductive control, or birth control is what I mean. And so, yeah, to me, I would choose that. I would choose, rather than feeling a homeless person, I would think that making a long-term change would be to not have them be born in the first place. But no, the government takes your money and then they decide how your money should be used. For virtue can exist only when there is free choice. This is the basis of a truly free society. It is not only the most practical and humanitarian foundation for human action, it is also the most ethical. Problems in the world that arise from the initiation of force by government have a solution. The solution is for the people of the earth to stop asking government officials to initiate force on their behalf. I don't know how, I can't emphasize how important that is. When you tr- ask the government or you support regulations to control other people, you are initiating force. You are a violent bitch. There's no pretty way to say it. You think that you're nonviolent, oh, you're a good person. No, you're not. You are not a good person. Evil does not arise only from evil people, but also from good people who tolerate the initiation of force as a means to an end. In this manner, good people have empowered evil people throughout history. Um, I've said in one of my live streams that Ayn Rand was saying that all altruism, or sorry, all tyranny was the product of altruism. Like, people had good intentions, but they employ that altruism through the initiation of force. So then that so-called good, because it wasn't voluntary, becomes evil. Having confidence in a free society is to focus on the process of discovery and a marketplace of values, rather than to focus on some imposed vision or goal. Right? Everything right now is so fake and so I don't, so contrived. It's like, how many? I mean, I don't think anybody can really. Very few people can say that they're free thinkers, especially if they're in the public school. If they're not, if they're ill-read, if all they do is sit around watching live vision. Yeah, you're just a mind control slave. You're just a puppet for the system. There's no free exchange of ideas going on. You're just basically you're basically a useful idiot. You're just basically doing what they tell you to do. Using governmental force to impose a vision on others is intellectual sloth and typically results in unintended perverse consequences. Achieving a free society requires courage to think, to talk, and to act, especially when it is easier to do nothing. Okay, y'all. I think I am done. Hopefully, people will listen to this or watch the live stream. But I'm gonna call it a night, a morning, and try to go back to sleep. Thank y'all for listening.